Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Games I Got Rid of and Why. So in this series I take a look at a bunch of games that I used to have in my collection but for one reason or another no longer do, and I tried to give an explanation as to why I came to the decision to part with them. Now before I get started on the 10 games here, I want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer when it comes to purchasing board games here. And if you use the link in the show notes or the QR code, then you can get 5% off your first order. Okay, so the first game I'm talking about here just so happens to be my favourite out of all of these, and a game I still rate very highly. Now this is Fruticula. Now Fruticula is a game that got next to no fanfare despite having a successful Kickstarter campaign and being designed by Virginia Gili, who is an amazing designer who's made some hugely popular and successful games. But Fruticula is a game that I think was, number one, a huge victim of its production. So this game had some of the worst and shoddiest quality of production I've ever seen. The pieces would fall apart in your hands as you were playing them and assembling them. But the gameplay itself was actually very interesting and had multiple layers to it as well. And it's essentially a worker placement game with a degree of commodity speculation, and you're collecting these different fruits and converting them into jams and then selling the jams for profit essentially. But the flow of the game was quite interesting because every round you'd play a card, and this card would give you an ability for the rest of the round as well as determining the workers you have. And they'd also have an initiative value on them as well, so you could kind of have fewer workers but go quicker, have more workers but go slower, and you'd even have different worker types which would have different strengths and weaknesses, and you had to play them in order, which added another layer of decisions into the mix there. And this is one of those games that you could kind of build a bit of an engine up by collecting these tiles, and all of the tiles were very interesting. They give you game-breaking abilities, and they all felt very powerful and really not subdued, and I tend to like games that do that. You might ask, if I have so many good things to say about it, why did I choose to remove it from my collection? And that's actually a difficult question to answer, but I think the main reason was, at the time I had this in my collection, I think I acquired 2 new worker placement games, which I like even more than this one. So I actually ended up buying Kalos and Russian Railroads at around the same time, which just by default pushed this one down the priority list, and I just knew I wasn't going to get it played anytime soon. So yeah, I did have to get rid of this one with quite a heavy heart, and I definitely feel like I'm in the minority here in terms of how I felt about it, because it's not a terribly well rated game, and obviously it wasn't popular, but I still rate this one probably like a 7.5 or an 8 out of 10, and it was one of my favourite games of the year. So it's just simply one of these matters of being a crowded genre within my collection, and I kind of like a mix of games, and I don't want a bunch of similar worker placement games. So yeah, maybe one day I would look at playing this one again, but I actually think the gameplay is great, and if you can find a copy out there in the wild, and you probably get it for pretty cheap, and it is worth your time. So a positive spin on why I got rid of the game there, simply because I have more games of the same type in my collection. So that is Fruticula. The second game here is another one that I still speak highly of. This is Kokopelli by Stefan Feld. So Kokopelli is definitely unlike any other Stefan Feld game, and it is purely card driven, and what you're doing is you're playing these cards out in front of you which will give you game breaking abilities, but if you play a number of the same type of card you can convert those abilities into points essentially. Now I love the variability here and the way the decks synergize with each other. Now my few issues with it, that I thought the game was a little bit too long at times, and much like Fruticula, it had a lot of competition when it comes to card games in my collection. If I like these kind of variable, clever card games, I'll probably lean towards something like Capital Lux over this one. And this might sound silly, but one of the big reasons I got rid of this one is because it came in a huge box, or a big box, when it really is just a card game. So I would have loved to have seen like this one being condensed down into a box half the size. I might even still have it in my collection then, because space is of a premium to me, and hence why there are so many good games on this list or this particular video, because I obviously had a high amount of games in my collection at the time, therefore I was even culling good games from my collection. So I think these first 2 were a victim of crowding essentially, whereas if I had infinite space they'd probably still both be in my collection. But that's why I got rid of Kokopelli. It fell down that priority list a little bit too long, and just other games I'd rather play instead of it. But no ill reflection of the game, it's still very good, and quite a quirky design. Next up, I have Gutenberg. So Gutenberg was a game that I was very excited for at the time. You don't really see these many Euros that look like this now. It had that more kind of throwback beige look to it. And a game all about printing, which I thought was quite cool. It had a cool theme. Now this one, you were essentially trying to collect these letters and fulfill these contracts. It was all pretty basic in the way it worked, and it didn't really do anything terribly new or innovative. But the one thing I did like about it more than anything was the initiative system, where before you even took your actions, you would program the kind of priority that you want by placing these different blocks, these little black cubes on your little board here. And if you invested, say, in one particular phase of the game, that means you'd go really early, but that means you're probably going later in the other turns or the other phases, and vice versa. You can spread them out how you like it. Maybe you want to do okay in all of the categories or really well in one category, and so on. So that was actually the one thing I really liked about this game, but the rest of it was pretty bland, pretty generic. I really wanted to like it as well because, again, I love the look of it, I love the feel of it, and some of the production was really cool as well. But this one, I'm quite surprised. Well, if you were to ask me when it came out, I thought it might have some legs, but after I played it, I thought this feels pretty generic and it's going to fade into obscurity. And sadly, it has. It's only been a year or so since this one came out, and nobody talks about it anymore. And I think that's probably quite an accurate reflection as to what this game is all about, because it is quite generic. So that is Gutenberg. Another game that came and went from a pretty successful publisher. This is Zapotec. So Zapotec was kind of advertised as a sister game to the T series by Board and Dice, but this of course isn't a T game because it begins with the Z. But this is by Fabio Lopiano, who I think is a great designer, or definitely an interesting designer, has made some games that I really do enjoy. And I was intrigued about this one as you are managing this hand of cards, or you're drafting these cards, you are using them to put presents down on the map and build these temples, go for these objectives and things. But it had this cool twist where I think the last card that wasn't drafted would be the scoring category for the round. And you were just simply scoring based on a number of different things, such as the tempo you're on or the type of terrain you're on. I don't remember a lot of the intricacies about it. I have reviewed it in detail, so be sure to check that one out if you are interested, and if you want more information as to why I decided to, or why I didn't rate it too highly. Ultimately, I thought this was one of those games where once you played it, you'd seen everything pretty quickly, and it didn't have that hook to draw you back into it anymore. It was almost like, the longevity was next to nothing on this game, and which is a shame really, because I think a lot of the other Board and Dice games had a huge incentive to go back to them because there was so much variability and things to try. This one really did miss the mark in that aspect of things. I definitely feel that was the case, but it was fine. I rate it about a 6 out of 10. Definitely not a negative thought on it, but it didn't quite cut the mustard in such a competitive field in terms of Euro games. I suppose the one redeeming feature about this one was that it did only take around 60 minutes to play, which was great. But actually, it had quite a cool resource management thing as well, which did lead you down a bit of a path to keep spamming the same things. But again, check out my review if you want more details on it. But ultimately, it wasn't a keeper. It didn't quite make the mark. Next up, I have Knight of the Ninja. This is a social deduction game with a degree of drafting, if I remember correctly. And you are going through this motion by going through all these cards in a particular order, assassinating the different players and trying to be the last one standing, I believe, and getting points accordingly. That's pretty much the gist of the game. I only played this one a few times. I think maybe I'm somewhat done with social deduction games. I don't really feel the spark to play them that much more. They're never as good as the Resistance, in my opinion, and this one was not as good as the Resistance, so it feels like it's kind of punching upwards. It's not really going to leave a mark on the hobby, and it feels like everything here has been done before. I think it's quite well regarded, and some people do think highly of it, but for me, it's just not as good as some of the other ones already out there. Next up, I have Trails of Tucana, which is a flip and write style game as you are building these routes on this kind of hex grid now, and you're trying to connect these different symbols together to start generating new points and connecting different camps to get even more points. It actually is quite restrictive in what you could do. There wasn't that much wiggle room to make too many mistakes. You had to be quite efficient. You could play in 2 different game lengths. You could play a very fast game, or you could play the bigger map. I actually think that the game didn't benefit at all from playing the larger map, and it was always a much more fun experience and a faster experience, of course, if you were to play the shorter map or the smaller map. And I like this one. You know, this is one of those games that's completely inoffensive. It's a solid 6.5 out of 10. One that's not going to take up too much space on your shelf. It has some reasonably interesting decisions, but I would have appreciated more variability. There's only those 2 maps. They felt the same. There was no kind of twists on the structure of the game and different things to make it a bit more interesting. Now, I understand that since the base games come out, there have been expansions which could potentially tweak the rules somewhat and make it, add some interest to the game. But I think I've kind of done this one. I played it quite a few times, enjoyed my time with it. It's a solid roll and write or a flip and write in a saturated category, but yeah, ultimately it didn't quite earn its spot on my shelf for the long term, despite me enjoying it short term. So that is Trails of Tucana. Next up, I have Pagan, The Fate of Roanoke. Now this is, I believe it was a 2-player only game where one player is like a Van Helsing vampire hunter kind of character, and the other one is more like a witch trying to complete this kind of ceremony or seance, whatever it is they're trying to do. And what you were trying to do as the vampire hunter is that you were trying to deduce who the witch could be by playing all these different, I think it was cards and abilities. I didn't play this game too much, so forgive me if my memory's a little bit hazy. But ultimately you were trying to whittle things down in order to take a shot at the right character and kill them, essentially. At the same time, the other player was trying to build up the strength of all their witch, whatever it was, in order to complete this ceremony. Now, the game had an amazing look to it. It had this real kind of haunting, cartoony art, which looked great, and the cards looked fantastic. But I always tend to find games like this where you have a good chance of taking a pot shot, taking a shot in the dark, and just trying to attack a character and having a good chance of winning just on pure luck. I find that those games tend to be a little bit anticlimactic for me. And in the game or games that I played of this one, that was the case. I didn't really have great information, and I was the vampire hunter character, and I shot one character and killed them and won the game without really thinking too hard about it. And I understand the odds aren't great for doing that, but when it's possible, I don't know, it just doesn't quite sit right for me, and it feels like, I don't know, what we're doing is just going through the motions where I think, you know what, let's just take a shot here, let's go for it, and potentially win instantly, and that's what happened. So maybe I was left with a skewed view or a bad view of the game because of that, and that left a dampened impression on me. But it's not my style of game really, and there was just a bit too much going on. There was tons of expansions and stuff that became a bit, it was a bit cumbersome to filter your way through it all. But ultimately, I think this has got its audience, and there's some people like it, but it wasn't one for me. The next game I'm talking about is one called Mouse, Cheese, Cat, Cucumber. I might be getting that wrong, but it was something like that. Now, this was a kind of an asymmetric game where each player has one of those different roles, and they all have a different winning condition. Now, I think I only played this one once, so I think I was the mouse character. I was trying to go through all these little holes and get to the cheese. These kind of modular map is always shifting and changing to block people off. Very chaotic, very confusing at times. I thought the rules didn't quite sit right with me. It was a little bit unintuitive or counterintuitive at times, and just a bit of a mess of a game. I did not like this one at all, and hence why I probably don't remember too much about it and try to forget about it really. So it had a very small box, literally took up next to no space on your shelving, but the gameplay still wasn't worth it. I just did not get on with it one bit. So that is Mouse, Cheese, Cat, Cucumber. Next up, I have Fiesta Mexicana. Now, this is a kind of a set collection and bidding game. However, all your bids are fixed on this huge board that each player has. And it actually had quite a cool idea and some interesting concepts here that I hadn't seen before. But what you're essentially trying to do is you were collecting these food items and trying to build patterns on your board. When you won a certain bid, you would put them on these cards on this bid to contribute towards that pattern. But whatever you would bid, you, or successfully win the bid, you would try and shift your board around, which would be a new range or a new lot of bids that you could play with. And I did quite like the way that works. You didn't want to use all your bids early or your best bids early, because you'd only be left with the worst ones, and so on. And I did like that idea of you can't bid what you want, you can only bid what's available to you. So I think that's actually a mechanism that could be explored further. There's tons of potential to be looked at there, but I don't think this was the game to utilize that mechanism, because the rest of it was fairly paint by numbers. It was a bit restrictive at times where you wouldn't really want any of the things up for auction. And yeah, it was pretty pedestrian in the way that it scored. But that one bidding mechanism was super cool, and I'd love to see that taken further and developed, but this was not the game for it. And the final game I'm talking about today is Gods Love Dinosaurs. Now, what a cool idea this game is, and I cannot think of any direct comparison in terms of a game it's like. This is a game where you are very delicately balancing this ecosystem, I suppose, as you have a bunch of critters who will eat certain types of terrain, then you'll have these kind of hunters who will eat the critters, and then you're creating these dinosaurs who will eat the predators. And again, they all have that need, and every now and then they'll need to eat, otherwise they're going to die. And not only will you have to balance the kind of quantities of these different animals to keep it as even as possible, so everything has something to eat, you'll also need to manage the spatial puzzle, because all the hunters and the dinosaurs can only move so many spaces before they die, and they need to find their prey within that time. So again, you do need to make sure you're keeping all these levels just right in order to keep everything satisfied. And then what you're doing is you're getting points for every time, I believe, the dinosaurs eat the predators. But again, you've got to have these predators on the board, otherwise the dinosaurs are going to die. So I did like the way the game worked, and I love the concept. And to be honest, I think I found the game more interesting from a kind of an experimental and concept perspective rather than the game itself, because it's definitely a fresh approach. Again, there's nothing else quite like it. It's quite interesting in the way it scales up, and again, balancing all those different things. But did I find it particularly fun or particularly taxing? I'm not quite sure I did. So I actually really wanted to like this game. It had a good table presence. All the meeples look great, and I definitely think there's some people who would really get a lot from this one. But for me, it's not one that I found terribly fun, despite finding it interesting. And of course, I want my games to be fun. And yeah, I think we were somewhat reluctant to remove this one from the collection. But now that it has gone, I must admit I don't really regret it at all, and I don't have an itch to go back to it, because I've seen what it does. And despite looking back on it with some fond memories and thinking it's a cool concept, it's ultimately not a game that I'm looking to play anymore, hence why it had to go. So that is Gods Love Dinosaurs. So there we have it. That's another 10 games that have left my collection. Some really good ones here and some pretty bad ones as well, but hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please be sure to hit like and subscribe to my channel. But for everybody else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye bye.